The knock came so hard that the door shook on its hinges, and Eleanor Ashworth dropped the needle from her hand before she even reached the latch. No one knocked like that in Hollowbrook unless something terrible had happened. She pressed her palm flat against the wood for a moment, steadying her breath, then pulled the door open to find a tall stranger standing in the gray afternoon light, a long object wrapped in dark cloth held stiffly in both arms. He did not speak right away. He simply looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has waited a long time to see and is not certain he is ready for. His coat was finely cut, his boots polished despite the mud of the lane, and behind him a black carriage stood with 2 horses breathing steam into the cold air. No crest showed on its door, but everything about the man told her he did not belong on this narrow street of crumbling cottages. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and careful, as though he had practiced the words. "Forgive the intrusion. I have something that belongs to you." Eleanor's mother, Margaret, appeared behind her in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, her eyes narrowing with the same suspicion Eleanor felt rising in her own chest. Strangers did not come to their door bearing gifts. Strangers came to collect debts or to deliver bad news, and their family had received enough of both to last a lifetime. "I don't know you, sir," Eleanor said, keeping her hand on the doorframe, ready to close it if she needed to. "And we are not expecting visitors." "I would not have come unannounced if it could be avoided," he answered. "My name is Julian Rothmere. I served with your father." The words struck her like cold water. Her father, Captain Edmund Ashworth, had been dead for 6 years, killed in the final campaign of a war that had taken so much from so many families and given nothing back. She had grown up hearing stories of his courage, though most of those stories had faded into vague, second-hand memories, since her father rarely spoke of the fighting himself before he died. She did not know the name Rothmere. She was certain she would have remembered it, because it was not a name easily forgotten. It belonged, she now realized with a jolt, to one of the most powerful dukes in the county, a man whose estate sat on the hill above the village like a fortress that never opened its gates to anyone. "You are the Duke of Rothmere," she said slowly, and it was not a question. "I am." "Then I cannot imagine what business you have with us." He looked past her for a moment, toward the small, sagging house behind her, the peeling paint, and the cracked window she had covered with paper to keep out the draft. Something crossed his face that might have been guilt, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "May I come in?" he asked. "Or would you prefer I say what I came to say here, in the street, where your neighbors can hear every word?" Margaret answered before Eleanor could. "Come in then, quickly." She stepped back to allow him passage, though her eyes followed him with open distrust as he crossed the threshold and ducked slightly beneath the low doorframe. Inside, the cottage felt smaller than usual with him standing in it. He seemed to take up more space than a man his size should, not because of his height, but because of the stillness he carried, the sense that every movement he made was deliberate. He set the wrapped object down carefully on the wooden table, as though it were something fragile, though its shape suggested otherwise. Long, straight, heavy at one end. "Before I say anything else," he said, "I must return this to you. It was your father's." Eleanor's chest tightened. She stepped closer, and with hands that were not quite steady, she pulled back the dark cloth. It was a sword. Not an ornamental blade meant for parades and portraits, but a real cavalry sword, its hilt worn smooth from years of use, its blade scarred with the marks of a life spent in service. She had never seen it before in her life, and yet something about it felt instantly, achingly familiar, as though her body recognized it even though her mind did not. "This was my father's," she whispered. "I was told everything of his was lost, that nothing came back from the field." "Nearly everything was lost," the Duke said. "This was not among it, because I kept it. I have kept it for 6 years, waiting for the right moment to bring it home. I apologize that it has taken so long." "Why would you keep my father's sword for 6 years and say nothing to us? We have had nothing since he died, nothing but deaths and pity from people who barely remembered his name." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she hated herself for it, hated that this stranger in his fine coat could see how close to the edge her composure truly was. Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, and Eleanor forced herself to breathe. "There were reasons," the Duke said. "Reasons I am not free to explain in full today. I know that is not the answer you want, but I promised your father I would see this sword returned to you myself, and I intend to keep every promise I made to him, even the ones that have taken far too long to fulfill." "What promise?" Eleanor demanded. What could my father possibly have asked of a duke? For the first time since he had entered the house, the Duke hesitated. His gaze dropped to the sword on the table, then rose again to meet hers, And in his eyes, she saw something that unsettled her more than any answer could have. It was not pity. It was something closer to guilt, mixed with a strange, careful tenderness, as though he were looking at a debt he did not know how to repay. "Your father saved my life," he said finally, "more than once. I owe him more than a sword returned late, but I did not come today to explain the whole of it. I came only to fulfill this one promise, and I have done that now." He straightened, as though preparing to leave, and Eleanor felt a surge of frustration rise in her throat. He could not simply appear with a piece of her father's memory, speak in riddles about promises and debts, and then vanish again into his carriage and his hilltop estate. "You cannot say so little and then walk out that door," she said. "My father is gone. My mother and I have nothing left of him but stories that no one will finish telling. If you knew him, if he trusted you enough to ask something of you, then you owe us more than silence." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened slightly, as though her words had reached a part of him he kept carefully guarded. "You are right," he said quietly, "and in time, I will tell you everything. But some truths are not mine to give away in an afternoon, in a house I have only just entered, to a woman I have only just met. Trust takes longer to build than a single visit allows." "Then why come at all?" "Because a promise delayed is still a promise owed," he said. "And because I wanted finally to see the daughter your father spoke of so often." Before Eleanor could ask what that meant, he gave a short bow, thanked Margaret for her hospitality, and turned toward the door. Eleanor followed him, unwilling to let him leave without at least one answer. "Will you come back?" she asked, standing in the doorway as he descended the 2 worn steps to the lane. He paused, looking back at her with the carriage waiting behind him, its horses restless in the cold. "Yes," he said, "sooner than you might expect." Then he climbed into the carriage, and within moments it rolled away down the narrow street, leaving behind only the fading sound of hooves on packed dirt, and the sword resting on the table, wrapped once more in its dark cloth by Eleanor's careful hands. Margaret said little for the rest of the evening. She moved about the small kitchen, preparing a thin supper, her hands busy but her eyes distant, and Eleanor understood that her mother was carrying her own private storm of memories, ones she had never fully shared even with her only daughter. When Eleanor finally asked what she remembered of the man called Rothmere, Margaret only shook her head. "Your father never spoke his name to me," she said. "Not once, in all the letters he sent home. Not in all the nights he sat by that very fire and told me pieces of what he had seen. If a duke owed him a debt so great that it brought him to our door after 6 years of silence, then it is a debt your father chose to keep hidden, even from me. Why would he hide something like that? I do not know, Eleanor. But your father was not a man who kept secrets without good reason. Whatever this is, I suspect it runs deeper than a sword returned late." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand, her grip firm despite the tiredness in her eyes. "Be careful. A man like that does not climb down from his hill without a reason of his own, whatever fine words he offers about promises." Eleanor turned the warning over in her mind long after her mother had gone to bed, unable to shake the memory of the Duke's face, the way his composure had cracked so briefly when he spoke of her father, as though grief still lived close beneath his careful manners. She wanted to distrust him completely, to file him away as another wealthy stranger amusing himself with the troubles of a poorer family, but something about the way he had looked at the sword, almost reverently, made that easy dismissal impossible. That night, after her mother had gone to bed, Eleanor sat alone at the table with a single candle burning low. She could not stop looking at the sword. There was something about it that pulled at her, a feeling she could not name, half comfort and half warning. She told herself it was simply the shock of the day, the strange visit from a man who held more of her father's story than she did. She reached out and touched the hilt, running her fingers along the worn leather binding, imagining her father's hand in the same place, gripping it in battles she would never fully understand. Slowly, carefully, she turned the blade toward the candlelight to see it better, tilting it so the flame caught the metal near the base of the hilt. And there, in small, careful letters she almost missed at first, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not a maker's mark. It was not a regiment number or a battle date carved in memory of some distant victory. It was her own name, Eleanor Ashworth, engraved into the steel beneath the hilt, in handwriting that was not her father's, dated years before she had even been born. She sat frozen, the candle flame trembling with her unsteady breath, staring at letters that should not exist. Her father could not have known her name before she was born, not with a date so precise carved into metal, meant to survive wars and decades. Someone else had placed it there, someone who had known, somehow, that a daughter named Eleanor would one day exist to receive this blade. Her mind raced through every possible explanation, and none of them made sense. None of them were gentle enough to let her sleep that night. She thought of the Duke's face again, the guarded sorrow in his eyes when he spoke of promises he was not yet free to explain, and for the first time she understood that his visit had not answered a single question about her family's past. It had only opened a door onto a room far larger and far stranger than she had ever imagined, one that reached back before her own birth, tangled somehow with a duke's private grief and a father who had carried secrets to his grave. Whatever waited beyond that door, she knew now that she would not rest until she walked through it herself. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat with the sword until the candle burned itself down to a stub, tracing the engraved letters again and again as though repetition might change what they said. By the time gray morning light crept through the paper covering the window, she had made a decision. She would not wait for the Duke to return on his own schedule, offering fragments of truth when it suited him. She would find answers herself, starting with the one place that might still hold some record of her father's final years of service. She dressed quickly and told her mother only that she was walking to the village to see the old regiment clerk, a man named Percival Hobbs who had once served as a supply officer and now spent his days keeping records for anyone willing to pay a small fee. Margaret did not try to stop her, though the worry in her eyes was plain as she watched Eleanor wrap a shawl tightly around her shoulders against the cold. The walk to Hobbs's small office took the better part of an hour, down muddy lanes and past fields still touched with frost. Eleanor rehearsed her questions the entire way, trying to decide how much to reveal and how much to hold back. By the time she reached the low stone building where Hobbs kept his ledgers, her hands were nearly numb, though she was not certain if it was only from the cold. Hobbs was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched low on his nose. He greeted her with polite surprise, since she had never visited before, and offered her a seat near a small, struggling fire. "Miss Ashworth," he said, once she had explained who her father had been. "I remember the name, of course. A fine officer, from what the records show. Brave, though the details of his final campaign were never fully clear to those of us who kept the books from a distance." "I am trying to understand something," Eleanor said carefully. "Do you know of a connection between my father and the Duke of Rothmere?" Hobbs's expression changed instantly, the polite warmth replaced by something more guarded. He glanced toward the door, as though checking that no one else might overhear, then lowered his voice. "That is not a name I am comfortable discussing, Miss Ashworth." "Why not?" "He came to my home yesterday. He returned my father's sword, and he spoke of a promise, a debt, though he would explain nothing further. If there is something you know, I am asking you, please, to tell me." Hobbs removed his spectacles and rubbed at his tired eyes, clearly weighing some private struggle. "There were things that happened in that final campaign that were never written into the official record," he said at last. "Things that certain powerful families preferred to keep quiet. I was a young clerk then, and I saw enough to know that your father's name and the Rothmere name were tangled together in ways that went beyond the battlefield. But I was never told the full truth, and what little I suspect, I have no proof of. I would be doing you no favor by repeating rumors I cannot confirm." "Please," Eleanor said, leaning forward. "Even a rumor is more than I have now." Hobbs hesitated a long moment, then sighed. "There was talk, years ago, of an arrangement between your father and the old Duke, the current Duke's father. Some said your father had agreed to protect the family name in exchange for a promise concerning his own family's future. Others said it was simple gratitude for a life saved on the field. I cannot tell you which version is true, if either is. All I know is that shortly after your father died, a great deal of money began quietly flowing toward certain accounts connected to your family. Money no one could ever properly trace, though everyone assumed it came from the Rothmere estate." Eleanor sat back, stunned. "We received no money. We have struggled every year since he died." "Then perhaps it went somewhere you never saw," Hobbs said gently. "Debts settled before they reached your door. Landlords paid quietly, so you would never know how close you came to losing even this much." "I cannot say for certain, Miss Ashworth. I only tell you what I heard, and I urge you to be careful how you use it." Eleanor thanked him, though her mind was already racing far ahead of the conversation, piecing together fragments that refused to form a complete picture. She walked home in a daze, barely noticing the cold, barely noticing the curious glances of neighbors who saw her hurrying past with her thoughts clearly elsewhere. By the time she reached her own street, she had made a second decision. She would not wait for answers to come to her in careful, guarded pieces. She would go to the Duke herself, climb the very hill she had avoided her entire life, and demand the truth directly from the man who seemed to hold every piece of it. Before she left the house, she stopped in the small back room, where her father's few remaining belongings were kept in an old trunk, most of them faded uniforms and letters too worn to read easily anymore. She had not opened the trunk in years, unable to bear the weight of memories it held, but now she knelt before it and lifted the lid, searching for anything that might explain what Hobbs had told her. Beneath a folded coat she found a bundle of letters tied with string, most addressed to her mother, their ink faded to a pale brown. She untied them carefully and scanned the pages, searching for any mention of the name Rothmere, but found only ordinary words of love and longing, a soldier writing home about the weather and his hope of returning soon. Near the bottom of the trunk, however, she found something she did not recognize, a single folded paper, unlike the others, its edges sharp and its ink darker, as though it had been written more recently, or handled far less often. She unfolded it with trembling fingers, but the writing was strange, half in a code she could not decipher, symbols and abbreviations that meant nothing to her untrained eye. Only one line stood out clearly, written in plain script at the bottom of the page. For Eleanor, when she is old enough to understand. She stared at the words for a long time, her heart pounding. Her father had known, somehow, that she would one day need this paper, this strange coded message meant only for her. She folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, deciding she would puzzle over its meaning later, once she had confronted the Duke with everything else weighing on her mind. It was this discovery, more than anything Hobbs had told her, that hardened her resolve to climb the hill that very day, rather than wait for the Duke's promised explanations on his own schedule. She did not tell her mother where she intended to go until she was already wrapping herself against the wind for the long walk. Margaret's protests followed her out the door, but Eleanor did not turn back. The estate sat at the top of a long, curving road lined with ancient trees, their bare branches forming a canopy that blocked what little sunlight the day offered. By the time the great house came into view, gray stone rising against a grayer sky, her legs ached and her resolve had hardened into something unshakable. A servant met her at the entrance, clearly startled to find a young woman on foot at the grand door, her clothes plain and her cheeks flushed from the cold walk. Eleanor gave her name and asked, as steadily as she could manage, to speak with the Duke. She fully expected to be turned away. Instead, after a brief and tense wait in a cold entrance hall lined with portraits of stern, unfamiliar faces, she was led through a series of long corridors to a study where the Duke sat behind a wide desk covered in papers. He rose the moment she entered, surprise clear on his face. "Miss Ashworth, I did not expect you to come to me. You said you would return sooner than I might expect," Eleanor said, "but I decided I would rather not wait to find out when that might be." A faint, almost involuntary smile touched his mouth before he composed himself again. "Please, sit." "I would rather stand," she said. "I have questions, and I intend to have them answered before I leave this house." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, gesturing for the servant to close the door and leave them in private. "Ask then." "My father's sword has my name engraved beneath the hilt," she said, watching his face closely for any reaction. "A name carved there before I was even born. I want to know how that is possible, and I want to know exactly what my father promised you, or what you promised him." The Duke's composure faltered, just slightly, the same crack she had noticed the day before. He walked to the window, his back to her for a long moment, hands clasped behind him. "Your father was a remarkable man," he said finally. "More remarkable than most people ever knew. When I was young, barely more than a boy sent into a war I did not understand, it was your father who kept me alive more than once, at considerable risk to himself. I owed him a debt no ordinary gesture could repay. That still does not explain my name on the sword." "No," he admitted, "it does not, and that is a part of the story I am not yet ready to share, not because I wish to keep secrets from you, but because the truth involves choices your father made that were not entirely his to make alone. I need time to be certain I tell it correctly, without causing harm that cannot be undone." Eleanor felt frustration rising again, hot and sharp. "You speak as though the truth is something fragile, something that must be handled delicately for my benefit. I am not a child, Your Grace. I have survived 6 years of poverty and grief without anyone handling the truth delicately for my benefit. I would rather have the whole of it, however difficult, than these careful half-answers." Something in her words seemed to land harder than she expected. The Duke turned back to face her, and for the first time, the careful distance in his expression gave way to something rawer, something that looked almost like pain. "You remind me of him," he said quietly. "The same refusal to accept comfortable silence. He would have said nearly the same words to me, in nearly the same tone. Then honor that resemblance by telling me the truth. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something internally, and Eleanor held her breath, certain she was on the edge of finally understanding. But when he spoke again, his voice had steadied, retreating once more behind careful walls. "Give me until the end of the week," he said. "I will tell you everything I know, I promise you that. But there are others whose lives are tangled in this story, and I owe it to them, as much as to you, to be certain of every word before I speak it aloud." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers immediately, but something in his eyes told her that pushing further would gain her nothing but a closed door. She nodded stiffly, accepting the delay though every part of her resisted it. "The end of the week," she repeated. "I will hold you to that." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and for the briefest moment, something like admiration flickered across his face before he masked it again with formal politeness, offering to have the carriage take her home, rather than let her walk the long, cold road alone. She refused the carriage, needing the walk to clear her thoughts, but as she made her way back down the hill, she could not shake the feeling that she had just glimpsed the edge of something enormous, a story that had shaped both her life and the Duke's long before either of them fully understood it. Somewhere in the tangled history between her father and this careful, guarded man, the truth waited, and she intended to have it, whatever it cost her to hear. Halfway down the hill, she stopped beneath a bare oak tree and pulled the folded paper from her pocket, studying it again in the fading afternoon light. The strange symbols still made no sense to her, but she noticed now, for the first time, a small mark in the corner of the page, a tiny drawing of a sword crossed with a quill, identical to a symbol she had glimpsed carved into the stone entrance of the Duke's own house. Her breath caught. Whatever secret her father had left behind, it was tied directly to the family she had just left, tied closely enough that its mark had been pressed into both a private letter and the entrance of a ducal estate. She refolded the paper with careful hands, more certain than ever that the coming week would change everything she thought she understood about her father, about herself, and about the quiet, guarded man who had once been saved by a soldier he had never stopped trying to repay. The walk home felt shorter than the walk up had been, her mind too occupied with questions to notice the cold or the ache in her legs. When she reached her own door, her mother was waiting, worry etched deep into her face, and Eleanor knew she owed her an explanation, though she was not yet certain how much of it she was ready to share. She decided, for tonight at least, to keep the folded paper and its strange symbol to herself, unwilling to add another burden to her mother's already heavy heart, until she understood its meaning more fully. There would be time enough for full honesty once the Duke kept his own promise, once the end of the week arrived and brought with it, she hoped, every answer she had been searching for since a stranger first knocked on her door with a sword wrapped in dark cloth. The week passed slower than any Eleanor could remember, each day stretching long and strange, filled with half-finished chores and glances toward the window, as though the Duke's promised answers might arrive early if she watched closely enough. She kept the folded paper hidden beneath a loose board in her bedroom floor, taking it out only at night to study the strange symbols by candlelight, though she made no more progress deciphering them than she had on the first evening. On the fifth day, a letter arrived, carried by a servant on horseback rather than the Duke's grand carriage. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant but urgent, the ink pressed hard into the paper. Eleanor opened it with unsteady hands. He asked her to come to the estate that evening, alone, after the household staff had retired for the night. He wrote that what he had to tell her required privacy no daylight visit could offer, and he apologized for the unusual request, promising it was not improper, only necessary. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before showing it to her mother, who frowned deeply but did not forbid her from going. "Take a lamp," Margaret said simply, "and come home the moment you have what you came for." That evening, Eleanor climbed the hill again, this time beneath a sky heavy with stars, her lamp casting a small circle of light on the frozen road ahead of her. The great house looked different at night, its windows glowing faintly, its stone walls seeming to lean closer in the darkness than they had during her daylight visit. A different servant met her this time, an older woman with kind eyes, who led her through quiet corridors to the same study where she had confronted the Duke days before. He was waiting, standing near a fire that cast long shadows across the room, and on the desk behind him sat a small wooden box, its surface carved with the same symbol Eleanor had seen on her father's hidden letter, a sword crossed with a quill. "You recognize it," he said, watching her face carefully as her eyes fell on the carving. "I can see that you do." "I found a paper," she admitted, "hidden in my father's things. It bore that same mark, though I could not read the words written on it." The Duke's expression shifted, something like relief mixed with sorrow crossing his face. Then you already hold half the truth without knowing it. Sit, please. This will take some time to explain properly, and I owe you every detail, even the ones that are difficult to hear. Eleanor sat this time, her earlier defiance softened by exhaustion and the weight of anticipation. The Duke remained standing, pacing slowly before the fire as he began to speak, his voice steady but low, as though the story itself required a kind of reverence. Your father and I first met on the battlefield when I was barely more than a boy, sent to serve alongside soldiers twice my age, because my own father, the old Duke, believed it would toughen me for the responsibilities I would one day inherit. I was not prepared for what I found there. I was frightened, useless in most ways that mattered, and more than once, careless enough to nearly cost myself my own life. Your father pulled me from danger on 3 separate occasions that I can recall clearly, and likely saved me in smaller ways I never even noticed at the time. That much I already understood, Eleanor said. Hobbs told me as much. There is more, the Duke continued. During the final campaign, the one that ultimately took your father's life, something happened that was never recorded in any official account. My father, the old Duke, made a grave error in judgment, one that, if it had become known, would have destroyed our family's honor entirely and likely ended in disgrace for our entire estate. Soldiers would have died as a direct result of his mistake, more soldiers than already had. Your father discovered this error before it could unfold into full disaster, and he took steps to correct it himself, quietly, without ever reporting it through proper channels. Eleanor's chest tightened. What kind of error? The Duke paused, choosing his words with visible care. My father ordered a retreat from a position that should have been held, based on false information he received from a source he trusted too readily. Had that retreat gone forward as ordered, an entire flank would have been left exposed, and the resulting losses would have been catastrophic, not only in lives but in reputation. Your father intercepted the order before it could be carried out. He countermanded it himself, without authority to do so, risking severe punishment, even death, for defying a direct command from a superior officer. His judgment proved correct. The position held. Many lives were saved that night, though almost no one beyond a small circle ever knew the full truth of what had actually happened. Why would he risk everything to protect a mistake that was not his to protect? Because exposing it would have destroyed more than my father's reputation, the Duke said. It would have shattered the trust of every soldier under his command, at the worst possible moment in the campaign, when unity mattered more than blame. Your father made a choice that night, a choice to protect the larger cause even at tremendous personal risk. When my father learned what had happened, he was, understandably, deeply shaken. He owed his own honor, quite literally, to a soldier who could have easily let him fail and claimed no responsibility for the consequences. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this new information with the father she remembered, a quiet, gentle man who rarely spoke of the wars at all, who seemed, in her childhood memories, almost too ordinary to have been capable of such daring. My father made your father a promise that night, the Duke continued. A promise that our family would forever consider itself in his debt, that whatever he or his descendants ever needed, our house would provide, quietly, without public acknowledgement, since the circumstances could never be spoken of openly without risking the very reputation your father had worked so hard to protect. That promise passed to me when my father died, along with the responsibility of honoring it. The money Hobbs mentioned, Eleanor said slowly. The debts paid without our knowledge. Yes. Every year since your father's death, I have ensured that certain obligations were quietly settled before they could ever reach your door. Rent that was never fully collected because the landlord had already been paid privately. Debts that vanished before collectors ever came calling. I did not want you to know, because I believed, perhaps wrongly, that you would refuse such help if you understood where it truly came from, that your pride, much like your father's, would resist charity even when it was offered as repayment of an honest debt. Eleanor felt a complicated tangle of emotions rising in her chest, gratitude twisted together with something closer to anger. You should have told us. All these years, we believed we had been abandoned, forgotten by everyone who once knew him. Do you understand what that belief did to my mother? To me? I understand it more than you might think, the Duke said quietly. And I have carried the guilt of that silence every single day since your father died. But there is more to explain, and I ask that you hear the rest before you judge the whole of my choices. What more could there possibly be? The Duke walked to the desk and opened the small wooden box, lifting from it a single folded document, older and more worn than the one Eleanor had found hidden in her father's trunk. Your father did not simply defy an order and save a battlefield that night. He also made a private arrangement with my father. One concerning you specifically, though you were not yet born when the arrangement was made. Eleanor's breath caught. Concerning me? Your father spoke often of his hope for a family, a daughter he had not yet met but already loved fiercely in his imagination. He told my father, quite plainly, that if he ever had a daughter, he wished for her to have a future secured beyond the uncertainties of a soldier's pay, a future that poverty could never threaten. My father agreed, and more than that, he suggested something further, something your father initially resisted but eventually accepted, as the years passed and circumstances in both our families changed. What did he suggest? The Duke hesitated, and for the first time since she had met him, Eleanor saw something like nervousness cross his composed features. My father suggested that someday, should circumstances allow and should both parties be willing, a connection between our two families might serve to honor the debt in a more permanent way. Not an arrangement forced upon anyone, but a possibility left open, a door neither family would close, should it ever seem right to walk through it. Eleanor stared at him, understanding dawning slowly, uncomfortably. You mean marriage? I mean nothing has been decided, nothing has been forced, and I would never wish to burden you with an obligation you did not choose freely, the Duke said quickly, color rising faintly in his face. I only tell you this because it explains, I believe, why your father had your name engraved beneath the hilt of his sword, before you were even born. He wished for you to inherit not just his blade, but the full weight and possibility of the promise made on his behalf, so that when the truth was finally revealed to you, as it is being revealed now, you would understand it had always been meant with love, never as a transaction. Eleanor rose from her chair, needing to move, needing space to absorb everything she had just heard. She walked toward the window, staring out at the dark grounds beyond, her mind spinning with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve. You are telling me, she said slowly, that my father and your father arranged a possible marriage between us before I was even born, and that you have spent 6 years secretly supporting my family, all while saying nothing of any of this until now. Yes, the Duke admitted. And I understand if that truth angers you more than it comforts you. I have wrestled with how and when to share it since the day I decided to finally return the sword. I did not want you to feel cornered by an old arrangement made without your consent, made before you had any voice in the matter at all. That is why I said nothing, why I chose instead simply to help quietly, to wait until you were ready to hear the fuller story, if you ever were. Eleanor turned back to face him, her emotions still tangled, uncertain whether to feel gratitude or fury or something else entirely, that she could not yet name. And if I refuse this arrangement, if I want nothing to do with an old promise made between two men who thought they had the right to decide my future before I could even walk, then I will honor your refusal completely, the Duke said, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his shoulders. The debt my family owes yours does not depend on marriage, Miss Ashworth. It depends only on honor, and honor requires that you be free to choose your own path, whatever that path may be. I would never force an old promise onto an unwilling heart. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception, but found only sincerity, mixed with a vulnerability she suspected he rarely allowed anyone to see. Slowly, some of her anger began to soften, though the confusion and uncertainty remained. I need time, she said finally. Time to think about everything you have told me tonight. It is too much to accept or refuse in a single evening. Of course, the Duke said. Take whatever time you need. I have already waited 6 years to tell you the truth. I can wait longer still for your answer. As Eleanor prepared to leave, walking toward the door with her thoughts still spinning, the Duke spoke once more, his voice quieter than before. There is one more thing you should know, he said. Something I have not yet mentioned, concerning a cousin of mine who has recently taken a great interest in my affairs, and who I fear may not welcome the truth I have just shared with you, should it ever become public. Eleanor paused at the door, a new unease settling over her. What kind of interest? Her name is Cornelia Whitmore, the Duke said, a distant cousin on my father's side, though close enough in blood that she has long believed herself entitled to a share of the estate, or at the very least, to significant influence over its future. She has spent the better part of this past year positioning herself carefully within society, cultivating friendships with families who might support her claims, should the opportunity ever arise for her to press them. She has no children of her own to inherit through, and I suspect she has begun to see my continued lack of a wife as an opening she intends to exploit, one way or another. You believe she would object to your family's debt to mine? I believe she would see it as a vulnerability to attack rather than a history to honor, the Duke said. If she learns that a soldier's daughter, however brave her father may have been, holds a place of importance in Rothmere affairs. She may attempt to use that knowledge against both of us, painting the connection as scandal rather than honor, hoping to weaken my position enough to strengthen her own. Eleanor felt a chill that had little to do with the cold night air waiting beyond the door. What would she do, exactly? I do not yet know the full shape of her intentions, the Duke admitted. But I have learned, through long experience, not to underestimate her patience or her willingness to bend truth into whatever form best serves her purposes. I only ask that you be careful, that you trust few people outside your own household with what you have learned tonight, until we better understand what we are facing. Eleanor nodded slowly, the weight of the evening settling more heavily onto her shoulders with each new revelation. You carry a great deal of danger quietly, Your Grace, for a man who spends his days behind such calm walls. A faint, tired smile touched his lips. Danger has followed my family for generations, Miss Ashworth. I have simply learned to keep it hidden behind calm walls, as you say, rather than let it show on my face for every visitor to see. Tonight, for reasons I do not fully understand myself, I found I did not wish to hide it from you. The admission hung between them for a moment, quiet and unguarded, before the Duke seemed to catch himself, straightening slightly and returning to a more careful formality. Forgive me. It has been a long week of preparing to tell you all of this, and I am perhaps less composed than I intended to be tonight. There is nothing to forgive, Eleanor said softly. I would rather see you unguarded than perfectly composed. At least then I know I am hearing the truth, and not merely the version of it you believe I am prepared to accept. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he nodded and stepped back to allow her passage toward the door. I will send word the moment I learn anything further regarding Cornelia's intentions. Until then, please, take the caution I have offered seriously. I will, Eleanor promised. The kind that comes from ambition rather than kindness, the Duke said grimly. I will explain further when the time is right. For tonight, simply know that not everyone will be pleased to learn that a soldier's daughter holds such a significant place in the Rothmere family's history, and I would ask you to be cautious in the days ahead, until I better understand the shape of the threat we may be facing. Eleanor left the estate that night with far more questions than she had arrived with, her mind heavy with revelations about her father's courage, the old Duke's guilt, and a promise made before her birth that now hung suspended between obligation and possibility. But beneath all of it, a new worry had taken root, one she carried carefully down the dark hill toward home, uncertain what danger might be waiting in the shadows of a family history far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The invitation arrived 3 days later, thick cream paper sealed with wax, requesting Eleanor's presence at a gathering hosted by Cornelia Whitmore herself. Eleanor stared at it for a long time before showing it to her mother, uncertain whether it represented an opportunity or a trap. Why would she invite you? Margaret asked. If the Duke believes she means you harm. Perhaps because she wants to study her enemy up close, Eleanor said, or perhaps because refusing would seem stranger than attending. I do not know. But I think I must go, if only to see for myself what kind of woman we are dealing with. She sent word to the Duke, who responded within hours, urging caution but agreeing that refusing outright might invite more suspicion than accepting carefully. He offered to accompany her, but Eleanor declined, reasoning that arriving on the Duke's arm would only confirm whatever rumors Cornelia intended to spread. Better to arrive alone, composed, and give her rival nothing obvious to seize upon. In the days before the gathering, Eleanor found herself unable to stop turning over the strange folded paper she had discovered in her father's trunk, certain now that its coded symbols must hold some connection to the danger the Duke had warned her about. She brought it once more into the candlelight, studying the crossed sword and quill mark in its corner, comparing it in her memory to the same symbol carved into the wooden box the Duke had shown her. She was no closer to understanding the coded words themselves, but she began to suspect the paper was not simply a message of love from father to daughter. It felt, the longer she studied it, like something closer to a record, a private account of promises made and debts owed, perhaps even proof of the very arrangement the Duke had described. She resolved to ask him about it directly, once the tension of Cornelia's gathering had passed and she could think clearly again. Margaret, too, grew increasingly uneasy as the day of the gathering approached, fussing over Eleanor's single good dress with more attention than she had spared for any garment in years, mending a small tear near the hem, and pressing the fabric smooth with a heated iron until it looked, if not fashionable, at least dignified. You do not have to prove anything to these people, Margaret said, smoothing the collar with careful hands. Whatever they think of you, whatever Cornelia Whitmore intends to say, none of it changes the truth of who you are or what your father sacrificed. I know, Eleanor said, though her voice carried less certainty than she wished it did. But knowing the truth and having a room full of strangers believe it are two very different things, Mother. I do not wish to be pitied, and I do not wish to be scorned. I only wish to be left in peace to understand what all of this means for our family. Peace may not be an option any longer, Margaret said gently. Not since a duke's carriage first appeared on our street. You have stepped into a larger world now, Eleanor, whether either of us wished it or not. All I ask is that you remember who you are, whatever that world tries to tell you about yourself tonight. The evening of the gathering, Eleanor wore her one good dress, carefully mended and pressed until it looked almost fashionable, though she knew it would never compare to the silks and jewels the other guests would display. She arrived at Cornelia's townhouse to find the rooms already crowded, candlelight glittering off crystal glasses and the low murmur of conversation filling every corner. Cornelia found her within minutes of her arrival, gliding across the room with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She was a striking woman, dark-haired and elegant, with a voice that carried just far enough for others to hear without seeming to try. "Miss Ashworth," she said warmly, though something calculating flickered beneath the warmth. "How kind of you to come. I have heard so much about you recently, though I confess, most of it was quite a surprise. I hope only pleasant surprises, Miss Whitmore." "Oh, I would not go quite that far." Cornelia's smile sharpened slightly. "It seems the Duke of Rothmere has taken a rather unusual interest in a soldier's daughter these past weeks. Society does love a mystery, and you, my dear, have become quite the topic of conversation." Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse quickened. "I was not aware my private affairs had become public entertainment." "Nothing stays private for long in circles such as these," Cornelia said, guiding Eleanor further into the room with a light touch on her arm, clearly intending to keep her close, perhaps to better display her to the gathered guests. "Tell me, is it true the Duke visited your home personally, carried something to you himself, rather than sending a servant as any proper gentleman would?" "He returned an item that belonged to my father," Eleanor said carefully. "Nothing more." "How touching." Cornelia's voice carried just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests, several of whom turned with poorly concealed curiosity. A duke, delivering packages personally to a girl living in a cottage with a leaking roof. One does wonder what such generosity might be purchasing. The insinuation landed exactly as Cornelia intended, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as several guests exchanged knowing glances, whispers beginning to ripple outward through the room. She understood immediately what was happening. Cornelia was not simply gossiping. She was orchestrating a performance, using Eleanor's presence and her own carefully chosen words to plant a story that would spread through society by morning, painting Eleanor as a fortune hunter, or worse, exploiting an old war debt for personal gain. "I would be careful with such implications, Miss Whitmore," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "My father served honorably and gave his life in service to this country. Whatever debt the Duke believes he owes my family is a matter of honor, not scandal." "Of course," Cornelia said sweetly, though her eyes glittered with satisfaction at having successfully drawn a reaction. "I only worry for you, Miss Ashworth. Men in the Duke's position often confuse pity for something warmer, and young women in your position often mistake attention for genuine regard. It would be a shame to see you hurt when he eventually remembers his obligations to his own rank and station." Several guests laughed softly, and Eleanor felt the sting of humiliation burning through her composure. She wanted desperately to leave, to flee the crowded room and its cruel, glittering eyes, but she forced herself to remain still, refusing to give Cornelia the satisfaction of watching her flee. It was at that moment that a familiar voice cut through the murmur of the room, calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that silenced conversations mid-sentence. "I was not aware this gathering had become a forum for discussing my private affairs, Cornelia." Every head turned. The Duke stood near the entrance, still dressed in his traveling coat, as though he had come directly from somewhere else the moment he learned of the gathering. His expression was calm, but there was steel beneath the calm, and Eleanor watched Cornelia's confident smile falter for just a moment before she recovered. "Your Grace," Cornelia said, dropping into a graceful curtsy that did little to disguise her surprise. "What an unexpected pleasure. We were simply discussing your recent generosity toward Miss Ashworth's family." "Generosity that is none of this room's concern," the Duke said, crossing the space toward Eleanor with unhurried steps, though every eye in the room tracked his movement with open fascination. "Miss Ashworth's father saved my life on more than one occasion, at great personal risk to himself. Whatever debt I owe his family, I owe it with pride, not shame. and I will not stand by while it is twisted into gossip for the entertainment of a crowded room." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor could feel every eye in the room shifting between herself and the Duke, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that his words had just changed everything. He had not simply defended her. He had declared, publicly and unmistakably, that his connection to her family was one of honor, spoken with a conviction that left little room for the scandalous interpretation Cornelia had been so carefully constructing. "Your Grace," Cornelia said, her composure cracking further, "I meant no offense. I only worried, as anyone might, about the appearance of such attentions." "Then worry less about appearances, Cornelia, and more about accuracy," the Duke said coolly. "Miss Ashworth's father was a braver man than most who will ever set foot in this room, myself included. I would ask that his memory, and his daughter, be treated with the respect both have earned." He turned to Eleanor then, offering his arm with a formality that somehow still felt deeply personal. "Miss Ashworth, might I escort you home? I believe you have endured quite enough of this evening's hospitality." Eleanor took his arm, aware of the whispers already beginning to swirl behind them, no longer whispers of scandal but something closer to astonishment, perhaps even grudging respect. As they walked together toward the door, she caught one final glimpse of Cornelia standing rigid among her guests, her earlier triumph replaced by something colder, sharper, a woman recalculating her strategy in real time. Outside, the night air felt like relief after the suffocating heat of the crowded room. The Duke helped Eleanor into his waiting carriage, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the events of the evening still settling between them. "You did not need to defend me so publicly," Eleanor said finally, once the carriage had begun moving through the dark streets. "You have made yourself a target for whatever she plans next." "I made myself a target the moment I decided to return your father's sword," the Duke said. "Tonight, I simply stopped pretending otherwise. She will not forgive being humiliated in front of her own guests." "No," the Duke agreed grimly, "she will not. And I suspect this evening has only sharpened whatever plans she already had in motion. I am sorry, Eleanor, that my attempt to protect you may have instead placed you in greater danger." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the simple intimacy of it settled warmly in her chest despite the tension of the evening. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. "I would rather face her anger honestly than hide from it and let her stories go unanswered." The Duke studied her for a long moment in the dim light of the carriage, something soft and unguarded crossing his features. "Your father would be proud of the woman you have become," he said quietly. "I only wish he had lived to see it himself." Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, grief and gratitude tangling together in a way that left her unable to speak for a moment. The Duke seemed to understand, offering no further words, simply allowing the silence to hold them both as the carriage carried them through the dark streets toward home, leaving behind a ballroom full of whispers and a rival whose humiliation would not soon be forgotten. When the carriage finally slowed before her cottage, Eleanor hesitated before stepping down, turning to face him one last time in the dim lantern light. "There is something else I must show you," she said. "A paper I found among my father's belongings, marked with the same symbol carved into your wooden box. I could not read the words myself, but I believe it may hold more of the truth than either of us yet understands." The Duke's expression sharpened with sudden interest. "May I see it?" "Tomorrow," Eleanor said. "It is late, and my mother will already be waiting anxiously by the window, but I will bring it to you tomorrow, and perhaps together we can make sense of what it says." "Tomorrow then," he agreed, though reluctance colored his voice, as though he wished she might produce it immediately. He helped her down from the carriage himself, his hand steady beneath hers, and for a moment they stood together in the cold night air, neither quite ready to end the evening despite its exhausting weight. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, "for tonight. For standing beside me when it would have been far easier to stay silent and let the rumors pass unanswered." "I could not have stayed silent," the Duke said simply, "not when it was your honor being questioned, and your father's memory being dragged through careless gossip. Some things are worth defending loudly, whatever the cost to one's own comfort." Eleanor watched the carriage disappear back down the dark lane before finally turning toward her own door, where her mother's worried face already waited behind the glass. She carried with her, into the warmth of the small cottage, both the sting of Cornelia's cruelty and the surprising comfort of the Duke's fierce public defense, two feelings tangled so closely together that she was not entirely certain, lying awake long into the night, which one weighed more heavily upon her heart. Eleanor arrived at the estate the following afternoon with the folded paper carefully tucked inside her cloak, her mind still turning over the previous night's events. The Duke received her in his study, and this time he did not wait for pleasantries before gesturing toward the paper in her hands. "May I see it now?" She handed it over, watching as he unfolded it with careful fingers, his eyes scanning the strange symbols with an intensity that suggested he recognized more of it than she had expected. His face grew pale as he read, and when he finally looked up, something troubled had settled behind his eyes. "This is written in a code my father used only for matters of the deepest confidence," he said. "Correspondence between himself and only a handful of trusted men. Your father must have learned it during his service, or perhaps my father taught it to him directly, given how closely their fates became entwined that night. Can you read it?" "Yes," he said slowly, "though I suspect what it says will complicate matters further rather than simplify them." He carried the paper to his desk, retrieving a second document from a locked drawer, one covered in similar symbols, and began comparing the two carefully, translating aloud as he worked through each line. "It begins as a personal letter," he said, "much as you likely already guessed. Your father writing to a daughter not yet born, expressing hope for her future. But further down, it becomes something more formal, a record, almost like a private confession, describing exactly what happened during the retreat he countermanded, naming names, describing precisely how my father's original order came to be given, and why." Eleanor leaned forward. "What does it say about why?" The Duke's jaw tightened as he continued reading. "It names the source of the false information that led to my father's flawed order. A junior officer serving under my father at the time, a man named Percival Whitmore." "Whitmore," Eleanor repeated, the name landing heavily. "Any relation to Cornelia?" "Her own father," the Duke said grimly. "According to this account, Percival Whitmore deliberately supplied false intelligence that night, hoping the resulting disaster would discredit my father publicly and clear a path for his own advancement within the regiment. Your father discovered the deception before it could unfold, but rather than exposing Whitmore outright, which would have caused a scandal threatening the entire command structure during an active campaign, he chose instead to quietly countermand the order and deal with the consequences of insubordination himself, protecting both my father's reputation and the stability of the entire regiment in one difficult, dangerous choice." Eleanor absorbed this new layer of the story slowly, pieces beginning to click into place with unsettling clarity. "That is why Cornelia has been circling your family so carefully. If people learned that her own father orchestrated near disaster through deliberate deception, and that my father was the one who quietly prevented it, her family's reputation would suffer far more than yours ever could." "Precisely," the Duke said, "and I suspect this is exactly why she has grown so aggressive lately, sensing that old secrets may finally be surfacing after so many years buried. If she learns that this document exists, confirming her father's disgrace in his own commanding officer's coded hand, she will do everything in her power to destroy it, and likely to discredit both of us in the process, before the truth can ever become public." A cold unease settled over Eleanor, as the full shape of the danger became clear. "Then we must be careful with this document. If she discovers we possess proof of her father's deception, she may stop at nothing to reclaim it, or destroy it entirely." "Agreed," the Duke said, folding the paper carefully, and returning it to the locked drawer alongside its counterpart. "For now, this stays hidden, known only to the two of us, until we better understand how to use it, if we choose to use it at all." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the study door, and a servant entered looking flustered, informing the Duke that a visitor had arrived unannounced, insisting on immediate audience. Before the Duke could respond, the door pushed open further, and Cornelia herself swept into the room, her expression carefully composed despite the obvious urgency that had brought her. "Your Grace," she said, her eyes flicking briefly, sharply, toward Eleanor, before returning to the Duke. "Forgive the intrusion, but I felt it important we speak plainly, given the rather public scene you created at my gathering last night." "I said only what needed saying, Cornelia," the Duke replied evenly. "I have nothing further to apologize for." "Perhaps not to me," Cornelia said, her voice tightening slightly despite her composed exterior. "But I wonder if you have considered how your recent behavior reflects on the family name we both share responsibility for protecting. Consorting so publicly, so intimately, with a woman of such modest circumstances, invites exactly the kind of scandal our family cannot afford, particularly given certain sensitive matters from the past that would be better left undisturbed." Eleanor watched the Duke's expression carefully, noting how he betrayed nothing of what they had just discovered moments before her arrival. "I am not certain what sensitive matters you refer to, Cornelia. Are you not?" Cornelia's smile turned brittle. I only mean that families such as ours carry histories complicated enough without inviting further complication through unwise attachments. Surely you understand my concern comes only from loyalty to our shared name. Your concern, the Duke said coolly, seems to arrive rather suddenly, given that you have shown little interest in our shared name's welfare until recently, when it became convenient to your own ambitions. Cornelia's composure cracked visibly for the first time, anger flashing behind her carefully maintained expression. You mistake ambition for concern, Your Grace. I have watched this family's reputation carefully for years, long before you decided to entangle yourself with soldiers' daughters and old wartime debts best left forgotten. Some debts should never be forgotten, the Duke said, his voice hardening. Particularly debts owed to men whose courage prevented far greater disasters than history ever recorded. Something flickered across Cornelia's face at those words. A flash of alarm quickly masked, and Eleanor understood in that moment that Cornelia suspected, perhaps even knew, more than she was willing to admit about her own father's role in the events the Duke had just described. The room grew tense with unspoken accusations, each side seeming to sense the other held knowledge too dangerous to voice directly in this particular confrontation. I think, Cornelia said finally, her voice carefully controlled once more, that we should discuss this further at another time, Your Grace, when tempers are less heated and outside company is not present. Her gaze cut sharply toward Eleanor as she spoke the final words, making clear exactly whose presence she considered unwelcome. Miss Ashworth is welcome in my home whenever she chooses to visit, the Duke said firmly. That will not be changing, regardless of your opinion on the matter. Cornelia's lips pressed into a thin line, and after a moment of tense silence, she offered a stiff curtsy and departed without further words, though the look she cast Eleanor on her way out carried a warning that needed no translation. Once the door had closed behind her, the Duke let out a slow breath, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. She suspects something, Eleanor said quietly. The way she reacted when you mentioned debts and courage, she knows more than she is admitting. I believe you are right, the Duke agreed, which means we no longer have the luxury of moving slowly. If Cornelia begins to suspect that proof of her father's deception exists, she will move quickly to either destroy that proof or discredit us both before we can ever bring it forward. What do you intend to do? The Duke considered the question carefully, pacing once more before the fire as he weighed his options. I think, he said finally, that the time for quiet protection has passed. My father spent years shielding the truth to protect the regiment's stability during wartime, and I have spent years since honoring that same silence out of respect for his choices, but silence has only given Cornelia room to maneuver, to threaten us both while hiding behind the same secrets that once protected honorable men. You mean to make the truth public? I mean to consider it carefully, and to do so with your full agreement, since the truth concerns your father as much as mine, the Duke said. This is not a decision I will make alone, Eleanor. Whatever we choose together, given how deeply your father's courage sits at the very heart of this entire story. Eleanor felt a swell of something warm and unfamiliar at his words, a sense of genuine partnership rather than the careful protection he had offered in earlier weeks. Then let us consider it together, she said. Because I agree, the silence has only ever protected the wrong people. My father risked everything to prevent disaster and protect innocent lives. He deserves to be remembered for that courage, not hidden behind decades of careful secrecy, meant to spare a family that clearly has little intention of returning the same honor. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration warming his careful expression. Your father would be proud to hear you speak so plainly, he said. I find myself equally proud, though I suppose that is not mine to claim. Perhaps it is, Eleanor said softly, surprising herself with the words. Given everything that has passed between our families, perhaps some things no longer belong solely to the past. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had yet named directly, before the Duke cleared his throat and stepped back, returning to more practical matters. We must decide how best to reveal the truth, and to whom, in a manner that protects you from further scandal, while still exposing Cornelia's father's deception, clearly enough that she cannot simply dismiss it as rumor. A public setting, perhaps, Eleanor suggested, somewhere she cannot easily control the narrative or silence witnesses afterward. An excellent thought, the Duke said, already turning the possibility over with visible calculation. There is a gathering planned at the regiment's old headquarters in a fortnight's time, a formal commemoration of the very campaign in question, attended by many of the surviving officers who served alongside both our fathers. If the truth were revealed there, before men who witnessed the events firsthand, Cornelia would have no room left to twist the story to her advantage. Eleanor felt a thrill of nervous anticipation at the plan taking shape, equal parts excitement and fear at what such a public reckoning might unleash. "It is dangerous," she admitted. "Cornelia will not simply allow such a revelation to happen without a fight." "No," the Duke agreed, "she will not, which means we must prepare carefully and trust each other completely, if we intend to see this through to the end, without losing everything we are trying so hard to protect." In the days that followed, Eleanor and the Duke met often, sometimes at the estate, sometimes in careful, quiet corners of the village where fewer eyes might notice their growing partnership. Together they studied the coded document line by line, cross-referencing names and dates with old regiment records that Hobbs, once persuaded of the seriousness of the matter, agreed to help retrieve from dusty archives few had touched in years. Slowly, a fuller picture emerged, one that confirmed beyond doubt that Percival Whitmore had deliberately falsified intelligence that night, motivated by ambition and a desire to see his commanding officer humiliated so that he himself might rise more quickly through the ranks. "There is enough here to satisfy any reasonable officer who witnessed the campaign firsthand," the Duke said one evening, reviewing the assembled evidence spread across his desk. Names, dates, even a secondary account from a sergeant who served under Whitmore directly, and grew suspicious of his conduct that night, though he never came forward at the time, fearing retaliation. "Will that sergeant testify now, if we ask him to?" "I believe he might," the Duke said, "particularly once he understands that the truth would finally honor your father's courage, rather than simply reopening old wounds for no purpose. I have already sent a discreet inquiry. We should hear back within days." Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn into the rhythm of this careful work, poring over old letters and cross-referencing dates late into the evening, her earlier nervousness slowly giving way to a fierce determination to see her father's sacrifice finally acknowledged as it deserved to be. She noticed, too, how naturally she and the Duke had begun working alongside each other, finishing each other's thoughts on strategy, exchanging glances of quiet understanding across the desk that required no words at all. It was during one such evening as they worked late by candlelight that a servant burst into the study without the usual careful knock, his face pale with alarm. "Your Grace," he said breathlessly, "there has been an incident. A fire, in the East Wing archive, where certain older estate records are kept. The staff are working to contain it now, but I fear some documents may already be lost." The Duke rose immediately, alarm sharpening his features. "Was anyone seen near the archive before the fire began?" "A groundskeeper mentioned a carriage leaving the grounds shortly before the smoke was noticed, sir. He did not recognize it, though he said it moved with unusual haste for a formal visit." Eleanor and the Duke exchanged a knowing look, both understanding immediately who was likely responsible, though proving it would be another matter entirely. They hurried together toward the East Wing, finding servants already battling the flames with buckets of water, smoke curling thick through the corridor despite their efforts. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, a significant portion of the archive had been damaged beyond recovery, though thankfully the locked drawer in the Duke's private study, where the most crucial documents remained secured, had never been threatened. "She is growing desperate," the Duke said grimly, surveying the smoke-damaged room once the danger had passed. This was meant to destroy whatever additional evidence might exist here, records that could further corroborate your father's account, even if she could not reach the original document itself. "Then we were fortunate," Eleanor said, though her voice trembled slightly at how close the danger had come. "If she is willing to risk fire to protect her father's reputation, what will she risk once we reveal the truth publicly, before witnesses she cannot control?" "I do not know," the Duke admitted, "but we cannot allow fear to stop us now. If anything, this proves how badly she needs the truth buried, which only confirms how important it is that we bring it into the light." They redoubled their efforts in the days that followed, moving the remaining evidence to a location known only to the two of them and Hobbs, whose loyalty had proven steady throughout the ordeal. The sergeant the Duke had contacted responded within the week, agreeing cautiously to attend the commemoration and speak the truth he had carried silently for years, provided he was assured of protection from any retaliation Cornelia's family might attempt afterward. As the day of the commemoration approached, Eleanor found herself lying awake at night, running through every possible way the confrontation might unfold, every argument Cornelia might raise, every counter she and the Duke would need ready. The weight of what waited ahead felt enormous, not simply a matter of clearing her father's name, but of finally closing a chapter of danger and secrecy that had shadowed both families for far too long. On the evening before the gathering, the Duke visited her cottage himself, arriving quietly without his usual carriage, dressed simply enough to avoid drawing the attention of curious neighbors. Margaret welcomed him warmly this time, offering tea that he accepted gratefully, and for a while the three of them sat together in comfortable, if tense, conversation, reviewing the plan for the following day one final time. "Whatever happens tomorrow," the Duke said, as he prepared finally to leave, "I want you to know that I do not regret a single step that brought us here, Eleanor. Not the years of silence, not the risks we have taken these past weeks, none of it. Your father gave me a life I did not deserve, and in trying to honor that gift, I have found something I never expected to find at all." Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the quiet sincerity in his voice, understanding fully now that whatever remained unspoken between them had grown into something far deeper than debt or duty. "Nor do I regret it," she said softly. "Whatever tomorrow brings, I am glad it brought us here together." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary before finally taking his leave, and Eleanor stood in her doorway long after his figure had disappeared into the darkness, her heart full of a fragile, hopeful courage as she prepared to face whatever the following day would demand of them both. The old regiment headquarters stood at the edge of the county, a solid gray building surrounded by a wide lawn where rows of chairs had been arranged for the formal commemoration. Eleanor arrived early with her mother, both dressed in their finest, though nothing could quite steady the nervous energy running through Eleanor's chest as she watched the grounds slowly fill with officers, dignitaries, and members of society who had come to honor a campaign fought decades ago. The Duke arrived shortly after, immaculately dressed, his expression composed despite the tension she knew he carried beneath the surface. He greeted several old officers with practiced ease, exchanging brief pleasantries, though his eyes found Eleanor's across the crowd more than once, a silent reassurance passing between them each time. Cornelia arrived later, sweeping onto the grounds with her usual confidence, dressed in deep colors that drew every eye, her smile as polished as ever despite whatever unease she must have carried after the fire at the estate. She greeted the Duke with careful formality, her gaze flicking toward Eleanor with something colder than the polite mask she wore for the rest of the gathering. Eleanor found a quiet moment before the ceremony began to walk the edge of the lawn alone, gathering her thoughts amid the low hum of arriving carriages and the rustle of formal dresses moving across the grass. She thought of the fire at the estate only days before, of how close their carefully gathered evidence had come to destruction, and she felt a fresh wave of gratitude that Hobbs had insisted on moving copies of every crucial document to a second, hidden location, a precaution that now seemed less like caution and more like foresight. She thought too of her mother, seated now among the crowd in her best dress, watching with quiet pride as her daughter prepared to do something Margaret herself had never quite dared to imagine, standing publicly beside a duke to defend her husband's honor, before witnesses who had once known him only as a name in an official record. A familiar voice startled her from her thoughts. "You look as though you are preparing for battle rather than a garden reception," the Duke said, falling into step beside her. "Perhaps I am," Eleanor admitted. "Cornelia will not simply accept defeat quietly, whatever happens today." "No," the Duke agreed. "But you will not face her alone, whatever she attempts, I promise you that." He hesitated a moment, glancing toward the gathering crowd before continuing more quietly. "Whatever else happens today, I want to be honest with you about something I should have said before now." Eleanor turned to face him fully, curious at the sudden seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" "These past weeks," he said, "working alongside you, watching you face humiliation and danger, with more courage than I have seen from officers twice your experience. I find that my feelings toward you have grown into something I did not anticipate when I first knocked on your door. I do not wish for you to hear such a thing for the first time in the middle of a public confrontation, should today's events lead us there." Eleanor felt her heart quicken, warmth spreading through her chest despite the nervous tension of the coming hour. "I have felt something similar," she admitted softly, "though I confess I was not certain how to name it, given everything else we have had to navigate together." A small, genuine smile broke through the Duke's careful composure, the first true smile she had seen from him all morning. "Then perhaps, once today's business is concluded, we might find a quieter moment to name it properly." Before Eleanor could respond, a bell rang out across the lawn, signaling that the formal ceremony was about to begin, and the Duke offered his arm to escort her toward the gathered rows of chairs, the warmth of the moment carrying them both toward whatever the day still had in store. The ceremony began with speeches from several senior officers, honoring the fallen and reflecting on the sacrifices made during the campaign so many years before. Eleanor listened with a tight throat, thinking of her father, wondering how many of these men truly understood what he had risked that night to save lives that history had never properly credited him for saving. When the formal speeches concluded and a lighter reception began, tables laden with refreshments spread across the lawn, the Duke gave Eleanor a small, meaningful nod. The moment had arrived. Together, they approached a cluster of senior officers standing near the center of the gathering, among them the sergeant who had agreed to speak, along with several men who had served closely with both the old Duke and Eleanor's father during the very campaign being honored that day. "Gentlemen," the Duke said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those nearby without yet alerting the wider crowd, "I wonder if I might share something relevant to today's commemoration, a piece of history that has remained hidden far too long." The officers exchanged curious glances, and slowly, as the Duke began speaking, more guests drifted closer, drawn by the gravity in his tone. He described, carefully and clearly, the events of that final campaign, the flawed order given based on false intelligence, and the soldier who had risked everything to countermand it, saving countless lives at tremendous personal risk. He spoke Edmund Ashworth's name with open pride, and Eleanor felt tears rising as she listened to her father finally being honored publicly, after 6 long years of silence. Then the Duke turned to the matter of where the false intelligence had originated, and the crowd's attention sharpened further. He gestured for the sergeant to step forward, and the older man, though visibly nervous, spoke steadily of what he had witnessed that night, confirming that Percival Whitmore had knowingly supplied false information to his commanding officer, motivated by ambition rather than error. A ripple of shock moved through the gathered crowd, whispers breaking out, as officers who had served alongside Whitmore began exchanging troubled glances, clearly recalling incidents and behaviors that now made unsettling new sense in light of this revelation. Cornelia's composure shattered entirely as the sergeant spoke, her face draining of color, her hands clenching at her sides. "This is a lie," she said sharply, stepping forward with barely contained fury. "A fabrication meant to distract from whatever scandalous arrangement exists between the Duke and this soldier's daughter." "I have documentation," the Duke said calmly, producing the coded letter, along with its translated counterpart, which he had prepared in advance precisely for this moment, written in my own father's private code, confirming every detail the sergeant has just described. "I would be happy to have any officer here who recognizes my father's hand verify its authenticity." Several older officers stepped forward immediately, examining the document with careful scrutiny, murmuring confirmations of the code's authenticity among themselves. Cornelia watched, visibly trapped, her earlier fury giving way to something closer to desperation. "Whatever my father may have done decades ago," she said, her voice rising, "it has nothing to do with the present, nothing to do with whatever inappropriate arrangement you have entered into with this woman." "The arrangement," the Duke said, his voice steady and clear enough for the entire gathering to hear, "was made between honorable men, your father excepted, who wished to see a great injustice quietly corrected without further scandal, to a regiment already strained by war. Edmund Ashworth saved lives that night through courage few men possess. My father, in gratitude, promised that his family would always stand ready to support Ashworth's family, whatever form that support might one day take. I have simply spent these recent months finally honoring that promise, openly rather than in secret, because secrecy has only ever served to protect the wrong people in this story." The crowd's murmurs shifted subtly, sympathy and respect beginning to outweigh the earlier shock, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest as she watched years of careful whispers finally give way to a truth spoken plainly before witnesses who could not simply dismiss it as rumor. Cornelia, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against her, made one final desperate attempt. "Even if this is true," she said, "it changes nothing about the impropriety of your continued attention toward Miss Ashworth. Society will still question why a duke pursues a woman so far beneath his station, whatever old debts you claim to honor." The Duke turned to face Eleanor directly then, and something in his expression shifted, softened, the careful formality of the public setting giving way to something far more personal. The gathered crowd fell silent, sensing that whatever came next would matter far beyond the political maneuvering of the afternoon. "Then let me answer that question plainly, before everyone here," he said, "so there can be no further doubt or rumor to twist into scandal." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Eleanor's breath caught as understanding dawned, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone nearby must hear it. "I did not pursue Eleanor Ashworth out of obligation," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed lawn. "I sought her out first because I owed her father a debt no ordinary gesture could repay, but in the weeks since, I have come to know a woman of remarkable courage, honesty and strength, a woman who has faced humiliation and danger with more grace than I have seen from anyone of far higher station. Whatever debt first brought me to her door, it is not debt that keeps me returning to her side." He knelt then, opening the velvet box to reveal a simple, elegant ring, and the entire gathering seemed to hold its breath collectively as he looked up at Eleanor with open, unguarded emotion. "Eleanor Ashworth," he said, "your name was engraved beneath that sword's hilt because your father always believed, somehow, that you were meant to become part of this family's story, long before either of us understood how or why. I did not fully understand his wisdom until now. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because any old promise demands it, but because I have come to love you, freely and completely, for exactly who you are?" Eleanor felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, the weight of 6 years of grief and struggle finally giving way to something bright and overwhelming. She thought of her father, of the sword he had left engraved with her name, of every quiet sacrifice her mother had made to keep their small family afloat, and of the strange, winding path that had led her from a knock on a cottage door to this moment, kneeling before her on a sunlit lawn surrounded by witnesses, to a truth finally spoken aloud. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, though it carried clearly across the silent gathering. "Yes, I will." The crowd erupted into applause and murmurs of astonished delight, the earlier tension of Cornelia's accusations melting away entirely beneath the warmth of the moment. The Duke rose and slipped the ring onto her trembling hand before drawing her into an embrace that felt, after everything they had endured together, entirely inevitable. Cornelia, recognizing that her final gambit had not only failed but backfired spectacularly, turned and departed the gathering without another word, her earlier confidence replaced by the quiet devastation of a woman whose schemes had finally caught up with her. Whispers would follow her for weeks afterward, the truth of her father's deception spreading through society far faster than any scandal she had once hoped to attach to Eleanor's name. Later that evening, after the gathering had dispersed and congratulations had been offered by more well-wishers than Eleanor could easily count, she found herself standing once more before her father's sword, now displayed with quiet honor in the estate's great hall rather than hidden away in a modest cottage. The Duke joined her there, slipping his hand into hers as they both studied the engraved name beneath the hilt. "He knew," Eleanor said softly, tracing the letters one final time. "Somehow, even before I existed, he knew this would be my story too." "Perhaps he simply hoped," the Duke said gently. "And perhaps hope, carried carefully enough across enough years, has a way of becoming truth in the end." Eleanor leaned into him, finally, fully at peace with the strange and winding path that had brought her here, from a knock on a cottage door to a sword engraved with her name, to a love she had never expected to find in the shadow of an old, complicated debt. Her father's courage had shaped this story long before she ever understood its full weight, and now, standing beside the man he had once saved, and the family he had quietly protected across 6 long years, she understood at last that some promises, however delayed, were always meant to be kept. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm. Margaret moved into a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds, close enough to visit daily but far enough to keep a household of her own, and Eleanor watched with quiet joy as the worry lines that had marked her mother's face for 6 long years began, slowly, to ease. Hobbs, whose quiet loyalty had proven so essential to uncovering the truth, was invited to catalog the estate's full archive properly, a task he accepted with visible pride, muttering that after decades of dusty ledgers, he had finally found records worth preserving. Word of Cornelia's father's disgrace spread through society exactly as the Duke had predicted, and within a month, Cornelia herself had quietly withdrawn from the social circles she had once dominated, retreating to a distant relative's estate, rather than face the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in her rival's downfall, only a quiet relief that the danger, at last, had passed, and that the truth, however painful for those it exposed, had finally found its rightful place in the open, rather than buried beneath years of careful silence. The sword itself remained in the great hall, though the Duke had a small brass plate added beneath it, engraved with a brief account of Edmund Ashworth's courage during the campaign, ensuring that any visitor who passed through the hall would understand exactly whose bravery had shaped the history of the house they stood within. Eleanor visited the sword often in those first weeks, sometimes simply to touch the worn hilt and remember, sometimes to bring her mother along so they might stand together before the engraved name that had started this entire strange and winding journey. On a quiet evening, not long before their wedding, the Duke found Eleanor once more standing before the sword, lost in thought. He came to stand beside her, saying nothing for a long moment, simply sharing the quiet companionship that had grown so naturally between them since the day he first knocked on her cottage door. "I used to wonder," Eleanor said finally, Why my father chose silence over recognition. Why he let 6 years pass without ever telling anyone what he had truly done that night. Now I think I understand. He was not protecting himself. He was protecting all of us, waiting patiently for the right moment, trusting that the truth would find its way into the light eventually, even if he was not there to see it happen. He trusted well, the Duke said softly. Though I suspect even he could not have imagined quite how the truth would finally unfold, or where it would lead the daughter he loved so dearly. Eleanor turned to him, taking his hand in hers, the engraved sword standing silent witness beside them both. I think, she said, he would be glad, wherever he is, to know that his sword found its way home not just to me, but to a family willing to finally honor the whole of his story, courage and sacrifice and quiet love all together. The Duke lifted her hand gently to his lips, his eyes warm with the same quiet devotion that had carried them both through danger, deception, and finally, into a future neither had dared to imagine, when a knock first sounded on a cottage door, 6 long years after a soldier's sacrifice had first been buried in careful, protective silence. Outside, the evening settled softly over the estate grounds, and inside the great hall, beneath a sword engraved with a promise finally fulfilled, 2 families long separated by grief and secrecy stood, at last, united by truth, courage, and a love neither duty nor danger had ever managed to extinguish. On the morning of the wedding, mist still clung low over the estate grounds when Eleanor woke, her heart already racing with a mixture of joy and disbelief that seemed too large for the small bedroom she had once shared, only with worry and quiet grief. Margaret helped her dress in a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, pale gold silk that caught the early light streaming through the window, and for a long moment, mother and daughter simply stood together before the mirror, saying nothing, needing no words to share the depth of what this day meant after everything they had survived to reach it. Your father should be here, Margaret said softly, adjusting a small pearl pin in Eleanor's hair. He would have been so proud, watching you become the woman you are today. Perhaps he is here, Eleanor said, thinking of the sword resting in the great hall, of the name he had engraved beneath its hilt so many years before this day was ever possible. In his own way, I think he has been here all along, guiding every step of this strange path toward this very morning. The ceremony itself was small, held in the estate's private chapel, rather than the grand cathedral many of the Duke's rank might have chosen, a decision he had made deliberately, wanting the day to feel intimate rather than another public performance for society's benefit. Among the modest gathering of guests sat several of the old regiment's surviving officers, men who had known Edmund Ashworth personally, invited specifically so that some piece of her father's world might witness this new chapter unfolding. One elderly officer, a man named Frederick Lowry who had served alongside her father in the earliest years of his commission, approached Eleanor before the ceremony began, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he took her hands in his weathered grip. I served beside your father for 3 years before that final campaign, he said. I want you to know, before you walk down that aisle today, that Edmund Ashworth was the finest man I ever had the honor of serving alongside, steady, brave, endlessly kind to the younger soldiers who looked to him for guidance. He spoke of you often, even before you were born, always certain you would grow into someone remarkable. It seems, my dear, that he was entirely correct. Eleanor felt tears threaten again, though she blinked them back carefully, unwilling to let her composure crumble before the ceremony had even begun. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. It means more than I can properly say, hearing these stories from someone who truly knew him. There is one more thing, Lowry said, lowering his voice slightly, something I have carried for years, uncertain whether it was mine to share. Your father once told me, the night before that final campaign began, that he had already decided what mattered most to him in this life, not glory, not rank, not even survival itself, only that his daughter, whenever she came into the world, would grow up knowing she was loved beyond measure, whatever circumstances life placed before her. I believe, watching you today, that his wish came true in every way that mattered. Eleanor embraced the old officer warmly, grateful beyond words for this final gift of memory, a piece of her father's heart, carried carefully across the years by a man who had never forgotten the soldier who once stood beside him. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of quiet vows and gentle joy, the Duke's voice steady and sure as he spoke his promises, Eleanor's own voice carrying a confidence she had not known she possessed until this very moment, standing before the small gathering of witnesses who had watched this unlikely love story unfold across so many difficult weeks. When the ceremony concluded and they turned to face the assembled guests as husband and wife for the first time, Eleanor caught her mother's eye across the small chapel, watching tears of pure happiness slide freely down Margaret's face. The celebration that followed carried long into the evening, laughter and warmth filling the estate's grand hall in a way it had likely not experienced in years. Eleanor moved through the gathering on her husband's arm, greeting well-wishers, listening to more stories from old officers eager to share memories of her father, now that the truth of his courage had finally become known throughout their circles. Each story felt like another small piece of him returned to her, filling gaps in her understanding that 6 years of silence had left achingly empty. Later, as the celebration began to wind down, and guests slowly departed into the cool night air, Eleanor found a quiet moment to slip away toward the great hall, drawn once more toward the sword that had started this entire remarkable journey. She stood before it in her wedding gown, tracing the familiar engraving one final time that evening, feeling the weight of everything that had led her to this moment settle gently into place. The Duke found her there, as he so often did, and came to stand quietly beside her, his hand finding hers without needing to be asked. "A strange thing," he said softly, "how a single sword, wrapped in dark cloth and carried to a cottage door, could unravel into everything that brought us here tonight." "Not strange," Eleanor said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think in the end, it was always meant to unfold exactly this way. My father knew, somehow, long before either of us understood it ourselves, that this sword was never truly about the past. It was always about the future he hoped for me, a future he could not build himself, but trusted others to help complete on his behalf." "Then let us honor that trust," the Duke said, "not simply tonight, but for every year we are fortunate enough to share together." Eleanor smiled, turning to face him fully, the weight of grief and danger and uncertainty finally settling into something quiet and whole within her chest. Outside, the last of the wedding guests made their way down the long drive beneath a sky full of stars, and inside the great hall, beneath a sword engraved with a promise finally, fully kept, a new chapter began, built not on old debts or careful secrecy, but on courage, honesty, and a love that had grown slowly, steadily, from the ashes of a story almost lost to silence. In the months that followed, Eleanor came to know the fullness of her new life gradually, learning the rhythms of the estate, the names of every servant who greeted her warmly each morning, the quiet corners of the grounds where she often walked alone to think of her father, and the strange, winding path that had carried his memory forward into a future he never lived to see. She kept the coded letter he had written her, framed now alongside the translated version the Duke had prepared, displayed in a small study that had become entirely her own, a space where she could sit quietly among reminders of the courage that had shaped every part of her unlikely story. Margaret visited often, her health steadily improving now that worry no longer weighed so heavily upon her days, and the two women would sit together in the garden some afternoons, speaking of Edmund, sharing memories that no longer felt quite so painful to revisit now that his courage had finally been honored as it always deserved to be. Hobbs, too, became a regular visitor, delighted to share whatever new fragment of regiment history he uncovered in his ongoing work cataloging the estate's vast archive, each discovery adding another small piece to the fuller picture of the man Eleanor's father had truly been. One crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after the wedding, a letter arrived at the estate bearing news that Cornelia had married quietly in a distant county, far from the society that had once celebrated her sharp wit and careful ambitions. Eleanor read the letter with mild surprise but no lingering bitterness, understanding by then that her own happiness had never truly depended on her rival's downfall, only on the truth finally standing where secrecy had once stood in its place. She folded the letter away without much further thought, her attention already turning toward the garden, where Margaret waited with a basket of late-season roses and news of her own small plans for the coming winter. The estate itself had changed subtly in the months since the wedding, warmer somehow, filled more often with laughter, and the comfortable clatter of a household no longer weighed down by old secrets. The Duke, too, seemed lighter. The careful guardedness that had once shadowed his every expression softened into something more open, more easily given to genuine warmth whenever Eleanor entered a room. Servants who had once whispered nervously about their reserved master now spoke fondly of the change that had come over him since a soldier's daughter first walked through the estate's grand doors. Eleanor took to spending her mornings in the small study she had claimed as her own, often working alongside Hobbs as he continued cataloging decades of estate records, uncovering along the way small, unexpected treasures of history that connected her father's story to countless others who had served beside him. She began, slowly, to compile these fragments into a proper written account, determined that Edmund Ashworth's courage would never again risk being lost to careful silence or convenient forgetting, whatever future generations might one day wish to know of the man who had shaped so much through one difficult, honorable choice on a battlefield far from home. The Duke supported this project fully, often joining her in the evenings to review pages she had drafted, offering details from his father's own private accounts that helped fill remaining gaps in the story. Together they built, page by careful page, a fuller record than either family had ever possessed, one that honored not only Edmund's bravery, but the complicated, difficult choices every person in this story had faced. Choices made from fear, from ambition, from love, and ultimately, from a shared hope that truth would someday outweigh the comfortable protection of silence. On the anniversary of the day the sword first arrived at her mother's cottage door, Eleanor returned to the great hall as she often did, though this time she carried with her the finished manuscript, its pages bound simply in leather, ready to be placed in the estate's growing archive alongside the coded letters and translated documents that had once seemed so dangerous to possess. She set it carefully on a shelf beneath the sword itself, a fitting final resting place for a story that had once nearly vanished into silence entirely. A full circle, the Duke said, joining her as he so often did in these quiet moments before the sword, his arms settling naturally around her shoulders. Not quite a circle, Eleanor said thoughtfully, leaning into him. A circle returns to where it began. This feels more like a path that finally reached the destination it was always meant to find, however long and difficult the journey proved to be along the way. The Duke pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, and together they stood a while longer in comfortable silence, the great hall settling into evening shadow around them, the sword catching the last soft light of day exactly as it had that very first afternoon a stranger's knock had changed everything. Outside, the estate grounds stretched wide and peaceful beneath a gentle autumn sky, and inside, a soldier's daughter and the Duke who had finally learned to love without guilt stood together, grateful for every difficult step that had carried them both, at last, home.